Colleagues, I can feel that you are very happy to see each other in the new season, but I will have to call you in order right now so we can start more or less on time with a 10 minutes delay. Welcome back to the PACE here in Strasbourg. I don't know how you felt yesterday in the plenary session in the building of the European Parliament, but I think it's more cozy and comfy in our building, so we are very looking forward to the reconstruction to be finalized. A lot has already happened since we last met in Paris, colleagues, so let's start our meeting here. I am told that we don't have the quorum, yes, so I will have to declare the meeting to be closed and to open a new one in accordance with the rule 47.4. We would want to welcome any new members who are joining us today with the first time being in the PACE. And of course, we are welcoming with the warmest regards our guest speaker of today. It's Ms. Peláez Narváez, the chairperson of the UN Committee on the Elimination of the Discrimination against Women, and our friend and ally, Luarasi, the president of GREVIO. Welcome, dear colleagues. Thank you so much for being with us today. You have received the draft agenda, colleagues, and I would like to suggest to adopt it. Do we have any abstentions to that? I don't see any. So we can say that the draft agenda is adopted. Thank you. Colleagues, you are now invited to approve the two sets of the draft minutes, those of our committee of the meeting being held on the 24th of March in Paris, and the minutes of the New York Women Free from Violence seminar, which we held in London on the 13th of March, which many of you have attended. I would like to suggest to approve them. I see no objections to that. Thank you, colleagues. Under the item 3, I'd like to remind you and inform you that there was various events and developments that are coming in our sessions. First of all, the next week we have important events of our committee, our Assembly and the Council of Europe with a standing committee to be held in Reykjavik on the 15th of May, which is right at the eve of the historical 4 summits of the heads of state and governments. And I would like to remind you, colleagues, it's only the 4th time in 74 years when it's happening, and it's due to the members of parliament of the 43 member states initiative, which was passed to the Council of Ministers and approved by the Council of Ministers. This event is happening on the 16th and 17th in Iceland, in Reykjavik. We have been informed that more than 40 heads of governments and states were already agreeing to participate, so we look forward to that. We hope that the summit will provide a vision of the future of our organization. Of course, in the focus of the PACE is making significant contribution. We hope that our committee will contribute to shaping the vision, and the debates of the road to Reykjavik are one of the topics of our session, and I hope, colleagues, we will have a great conversation on that. During this very packed months, I think you have already seen the agenda. We'll also have a meeting, No Hate Parliamentary Alliance in Vienna on the 8th of May, about which we will hear more later from our dear colleague Petra. On the 12th of May, we have a committee meeting in Paris, where we will hold the hearings for which there was no space, unfortunately, this week. And I hope many of you will be able to come physically, as we will have the question consent joint hearing with the Parliamentary Platform for the Rights of the LGBTI people in Europe, and institutional racism of law enforcement authorities against Roma people and travelers on our agenda in this Paris Paris meeting. I would like to inform you that on the 22nd of May we have the meeting of the Parliamentary Platform of the LGBTI people in Europe. And finally in May, as a dessert, is another standing committee. This time it will be held in Riga on the 26th of May. We will mark also the beginning of the Latvian chairmanship of the Committee of Ministers, which I believe will be very fruitful for all of us. I would also like to remind you, colleagues, that the very important nomination for the Václav Havel Prize can be made until the 30th April sharp. So if you haven't done so, please do. The item number 4 on our agenda is preventing and combating violence against women with disabilities. And dear members, it's a great pleasure for us today to give the floor to our first guest speaker, Vice Chair Béatrice Fresko Rolfo, to present her latest, not the guest speaker, but our member, sorry, it's a lack of sleep as always, to present her latest work on the report on combating violence against women with disabilities. Béatrice, please, you have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je vais d'abord...
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'd like to start by thanking the various different speakers who will be taking the floor during this session. I think all of us have an enormous amount to learn from what they have to tell us. So this is the second information document I'll be presenting to the committee. Obviously, this is about women with disabilities who tend to be made invisible in society. Women who suffer enormously, and they're forced into a situation of ever greater vulnerability by society. So, over this period of time, I've had virtual meetings with Ms. Pirko Malekemaki, representative of the European Forum for Disabilities. I also talked to Yolanda Miat and Natalia Ostiudju from the UN Office for Women in Europe and Central Asia. I also spoke to Ms. Uldry. She's the coordinator for the European Forum on Disabilities, and I had a bilateral virtual meeting with Jalpin, National Rapporteur, UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of People with Disabilities on the 14th of April 2022. So this is a recurrent issue. That's to say, the barriers which women with disabilities face, difficulties in terms of accessibility to infrastructure, their vulnerability, financial dependency, as well as emotional and family dependency, which is often forced upon them. Women with disabilities face all sorts of problems in terms of becoming victims, and their perpetrators of the acts against them are often enjoy great impunity. That we heard that during the last hearing.
Nos discussions avec les différentes discussions que j'ai eues avec les...
With the various different discussions I've had in recent months, much of what was said focused on sexual violence. I talked, as I said, to Ms. Malekmaki. She talked about a wall of silence surrounding sexual violence committed against women in institutional settings. And she talked about the work which has been done in this field in Finland. So there's a recurrent issue, which is the fear that these women have of having to leave the institution if they were to report the aggressor to the police. And parallel to this, there's clearly a sense of fear within the authorities to punish the people responsible for such acts who work in institutions, because they're afraid they won't be able to find social workers or others to replace them. The problem is that there aren't enough candidates for these posts. So in everything I heard, there was a leitmotif, which is that survivors who report such attacks to the police, the police don't make time for them, they don't give them necessary support, there isn't enough legal aid. So if they retain their legal status, and often their legal status, their ability to speak for themselves, is taken away from them by the courts, they face enormous barriers. My colleague Margaret talked about this in the committee. This is an issue she's worked on a lot. The fact that women with disabilities, in particular psychosocial disabilities, face such discrimination, but all too often their situation simply isn't taken seriously. This is something which I found very hard to stomach, the fact that society doesn't take this violence seriously. Mr. Quinn, the UN Special Rapporteur on this matter, reminded the importance of facilitating access to justice, and this is something we all agree with. When it comes to preventing violence committed against disabled women, we've often talked about the role of institutions. All too often, this violence takes place within an institutional setting. I'd like to refer back to another report adopted by the plenary of the Council of the importance of enabling women with disabilities, people with disabilities, to move out of this institutional setting. And what's becoming ever more obvious is that such women don't have access to the information they need to escape this spiral of violence. Either they're unable to access this information because of learning difficulties, or they're deaf, or they're visually impaired, so they're unable to inform themselves as to what their rights are. The CEDAW and CDPH have pointed out in their observations that women are particularly affected by discrimination in an employment setting, in particular during recruitment interviews. Such discrimination is also a form of violence, and that's something else I wanted to bring to the fore in this report. Another strand of the work, education for social and emotional and sexual education. This is very important for people with disabilities. Obviously, stereotypes come to the fore here. Women are often labelled with all sorts of stereotypes, which means they are then fair game, in effect, for all types of introduce within an institutional setting. And I think many of us have heard of examples of disabled women falling pregnant in such institutions, and that, I think, reveals the extent of the problem. So we'll be moving on to the other speakers in a moment. But I'd like to stress that when we talk about forced sterilisation, so my work suggests that only Sweden provides for compensation for victims of forced sterilisation. That's an important observation. I think other countries would do well to follow Sweden's example. Another aspect I'll be focusing on in this report is the fact that women with disabilities should be able to participate in the decision-making process whenever policy concerns them. There's another important aspect of course, is the implementation of that, so as to ensure that they get the help they need. I haven't fully decided yet, but I'll be asking the committee for authorization to organise a study visit. We thought about Denmark, which has made support for disabled people a priority policy area. Perhaps we could also organise visits to other countries so as to touch on other aspects of this issue. So just to wind up my comments on the information notes, I'd like to quote Ellen Portal. When society considers and treats a person as somebody of lesser value or unequal, the barrier protecting that person against psychological, sexual, physical violence disappear. Thank you. That completes my presentation.
Thank you, dear Béatrice. Thank you for concrete examples which are arriving already from the member states such as Sweden. And indeed, the fear of reporting is decreasing the cases, decreasing the studies, and decreasing the practical help. And from the countries which are now being at the conflict and the war of aggression, we can feel it, such as my home country, Ukraine. Colleagues, I would like to suggest you to support our good friend and colleague Béatrice in her endeavours and intention to visit Denmark as the first focal point of the visit for the report. And if there are no abstentions to that, I would suggest that we confirm the requested field visit to Denmark. And if there will be any other geographical necessities, Béatrice, I think we will be happy to support the further member states. On this point, I would like to give the floor now to Ana Peláez Narváez. Ms. Peláez, you are not only the chairperson of the CEDAW, but you're also a Secretary General of the European Disability Forum. I can tell you I've been personally working with European Disability Forum back in the days in Brussels. In your own country, in Spain, you are very well known for your work. You are also Executive Vice President of the CERMI Women's Foundation, the umbrella organization which comprises women with disabilities. You're also High Commissioner for Solidarity and International Cooperation with the Spanish National Organization of the Blind, called Blind Once. And this impressive resume can only make us very happy and honored that you are today with us. And I'm passing the floor to you, Ms. Peláez.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. C'est un honneur pour moi représenter.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you today. I'm representing the CEDAW Committee of the United Nations. Thank you for giving me the possibility to attend your meeting and to talk about this important question, that's to say, the situation of women with disabilities. I would like to start by underlining the fantastic cooperation which the CEDAW Committee has had with the Council of Europe. In particular, gracias to the work of my colleague here, with whom we enjoy excellent cooperation. We work together in the EDVO platform. This is an international platform devoted to the fight against violence against women, against women. We also work with GREVIO, and our cooperation with them and you is important throughout the Europe region. So I really would like to congratulate all of you for your excellent work. So, moving on now to the work done by the World Health Organization. You'll find this information on the screen. One woman out of 5 lives with a disability in the world. Contributing factors contributing to poor quality of life of disabled men and women is violence. And in many cases, violence actually exacerbates the disability. There are also other factors, such as harmful practices directed against women, which can also create or exacerbate disabilities. Gender violence against women and girls with disabilities is a matter of permanent attention for the UN CEDAW Committee. Its consideration is carried out adopting a twin-pronged approach. On the one hand, we review the general conditions for women, in particular when it comes to violence against women. At the same time, we pay particular attention to the needs of women with disabilities. I'd like to refer, for example, here to the General Recommendation number 35 pertaining to violence against women, or the need to take on board the needs of women with disabilities. That's covered by that recommendation. Or more specific issues which are often raised by member states in the CEDAW Committee. So let me tell you about some of the relevant aspects which we should bear in mind when it comes to considering gender-based violence against women and girls with disabilities. We do have to think about the implications of equality and non-discrimination in the context of the legislation, policy making and public situation in the countries in question. Obviously, access to justice is very important. It's also important to examine harmful, damaging practices affecting women with disabilities. We'll be coming back to this later, of course. Gender-based violence against women, trafficking and sexual exploitation of women, and I would include health and reproductive health under that heading, emotional and mental health. That's also intricately linked. We picked up some phone interference there. Obviously, it's important to ensure that women have access to information. Legal capacity is very important, as is marriage and family relations, living in the community, and follow-up, which the committee is constantly conducting when it comes to the question of violence against women with disabilities. So I'm sharing with you references to a series of presentations we've done. I'm basing this on the observations and conclusions which the committee has arrived at over the last 2 years in the Europe region. Georgia, Hungary, Norway, Slovenia, Armenia, Belgium, Finland, Switzerland, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Portugal, Turkey, and Azerbaijan.
Tous les pays que donc on a fait une étude pour.
So those are the countries which our study has been looking into to give you a better idea of the situation. Next slide. This is civil society's contribution on gender-based violence against women and girls with disabilities. Here you can see a table which shows that sometimes it's very difficult for CEDAW to fully study the situation regarding violence against women with disabilities because we often lack information. And when we do get information, normally this information is quite limited. So you can see on this table, for example, sometimes we get information from general NGOs, sometimes it's DPOs. So these are organizations for women with disabilities. What you practically never see is organizations representing women and girls with disabilities, providing specific information directly to us regarding the problems they face in terms of violence or respect of the other rights enshrined by this CEDAW Convention. Here we look at the concerns regarding different countries in the field of violence against women and girls with disabilities. So if, for example, the committee has examined the question of access to justice, legal capacity, harmful practices, violence against women, trafficking and exploitation of prostitution, free, full and informed consent, etc. So in those, under those different headings, you'll find information about all the different countries. I would also underline why this is important. For example, if we talk about access to justice, generally speaking, there are extremely serious obstacles which mean that women with disabilities practically never are able to access justice. So, for example, a lack of specific rules concerning their needs in this field. When it comes to harmful practice, we will see that in different countries the situation differs. We can see what's happening. So when it comes to forced sterilization, for example, this is a fairly common, or should I say almost normal, in inverted commas, practice concerning women with mental health disabilities or psychosocial disabilities. When it comes to violence committed against women in general, or indeed women with disabilities who are victims of this type of violence, generally speaking, this information doesn't specifically concern violence against women. Sexual exploitation and trafficking is an area in which we've seen that there are numerous cases of violence against women with disabilities. But free and full and informed consent is simply not taken into consideration in any of the countries which we examined in this report. The same would apply to access to health, or indeed other aspects of life, marriage, family life. Lots of women with disabilities have children, and in many cases they are unable to retain custody of their children if they're disabled. In some cases they're not even to stay in an institution with the children because their custody is removed. So what are our recommendations? You have general information about a series of countries here. I would like to draw your attention to the recommendations adopted by CEDAW regarding violence against women and girls with disabilities. When it comes to equality and non-discrimination in general policy making, generally speaking, all policy making regarding disabilities must address directly this situation that very rarely happens. In more fundamental terms, it's essential that general policy making and women's rights represent the diversity of all women, and in particular those with disabilities. But in all this policy making and in our recommendations, there's an important point, which is direct consultation of women with disabilities. The guiding principle here must be that these women, who are representative of women with disabilities, should be consulted and actively involved when it comes to formulating policy on women with disabilities in their countries. When it comes to access to justice, I should start by saying that lots of women with disabilities are unable to access justice because of a lack of legal capacity. If these women don't have legal capacity, and if they have to be represented by somebody else in their dealings with the judiciary, that means they are unable to describe and denounce the specific circumstances of the violence they face. However, it's also important to underline that the judicial system in general is not accessible for people with disabilities. So this means, for example, a woman with a mental disability, or a woman who is in a wheelchair. If such women want to be able to access justice, for whatever circumstances, they must be able to do so. But for the time being, the obstacles are enormous. This is the reason that one of our recommendations concerns training of legal staff, those working in the legal system and the judiciary must be aware of the specific circumstances of different people and women with disabilities. That's an important consideration. Access, for example, to free legal aid is very important. Some countries, Georgia, for example, have provided free legal aid and access to justice for women with disabilities so as to speed up access to justice for these very specific groups. And these women make up 20% of the total female population. In other countries such as Turkey, we see that a woman with a disability, for example, isn't allowed to become a judge. That's clearly a shortcoming in legislation. There are other countries which raise other barriers to access to justice. So we'll come back to this, I think. But women with disabilities must be aware of their rights, and they must be aware of the fact that they are perfectly entitled to report any limitation on their access to justice. So once again, in our report, we contain reference to lots of countries here. Legal capacity. This is covered by Article 15 of the CEDAW Convention. It's very difficult for us to examine the legal situation regarding legal capacity for women with disabilities because not enough information is made available by member states, by civil society, and by other interested parties when we carry out our examination of information regarding the different countries in the CEDAW committee. So I can tell you, for example, okay, here we talk about the recommendation on Belgium. That covers one of the countries we've looked at. But restrictions regarding legal capacity affecting women with disabilities is pretty widespread in many countries in the Europe region when it comes to harmful practices. I'd just like to explain that when it comes to issues such as criminalisation of forced sterilisation, or indeed other harmful practices which primarily affect women, in particular women with disabilities, this is not something which legislation in many states actually addresses.
And even if it is taken into account, there is no act of reparation carried out with victims. So here you can see some recommendations that the CEDAW committee has made for 12 different countries in Europe, which focus on these issues. Here I'd like to underline one practice, of the one of forced marriages. Which is something that's been denounced by quite a few women with disabilities. It's women who often will try to marry these women and then to have the chance to be able to leave their country together with the woman as if they were an assistant. It's a way for them to be able to get out of the country for these men. That's how they use it. So this needs to be taken into account. This is also a form of violence. I've spoken directly about violence against women and what's taken into account in Article 5 of the CEDAW Convention. So on the one hand, in general, there is no legislation concerning violence against women in many countries. And if legislation exists, then in general the makeup of the groups in specific details is not taken into account in the law. But there are examples where sexual aggression or rape against women with disabilities, well, the prison sentence you would get would be less than if you carried the same act out against a woman without disability. That's some states in our region doing that. So this is really something that needs to be reviewed. We must draw attention to the fact that there is no official data if we look at violence against women with disabilities. And why? Because those groups often don't recognize the way they're being treated by others as violence. It's something that they've lived with on a daily basis. They can have trouble recognizing it as such. They don't realize that it's something that they can take legal action against. There's also, of course, the fear of losing support. They can be fear of losing their lives. For example, those who do not make a complaint against their guardian, their legal guardian, because they have nowhere to live if not with that person. Or, for example, within institutions as well, where these women might live, there is a tendency to not to be afraid about making criminal complaints against them. You can see the recommendations that we've made here on the screen for specific countries about this issue I've just mentioned. Just take into account about the variability of disability must be taken into account when gathering data about violence against women. There are very few countries where those variables are taken into account when talking about the murder of women or any other kind of violence against women. There's a lot to be done, especially in early identification and prevention of violence against women with disabilities. Trafficking and exploitation and prostitution, that's dealt with in Article 6 of the CEDAW Convention. I can tell you that there are many countries which are listed here, and I'll be talking about various countries, but we've seen what's happened in some countries. In Ukraine, for example, could happen in others. What happens there? The majority of women who, within institutions, are girls that are in public institutions, are women with disabilities. These women are girls who are in these institutions, these public institutions, orphanages, etc., are at serious risk of falling in the hands of sexual exploitation. We can see that in some institutions, it can be particularly difficult. If there's a country where there's an armed conflict going on, it can be quite difficult. The majority of people in institutions, in those situations, they're not in some sort of civil registry, they may not have an ID card, etc. That increases the risk of falling in the hands of traffickers. If we talk about health issues right now, and sexual and reproductive health, as well as mental health, once again, we see serious obstacles that are faced by women with disabilities. I don't have much time left, but here you can see on the screen the recommendations that we've made. What I can tell you is that the possibility of doing genetic exploration by a gynecologist can be difficult. It could be that there's no accessibility to such services. To carry out the proper medical exploration as well, examination is not possible for some of those women who are already victims of sexual violence. if we talked about free and informed consent, once again, it's something that's not respect in the legislation of many countries. We've got an example here of Belgium. There's also Portugal, many countries actually. And in fact, even if in the legislation there is some rule against forced sterilization, what you can see sometimes is there's a great deal of permissiveness around the idea in general. Forced sterilization is something which puts the woman into a position of serious exposure to sexual violence because the community around the woman knows that she has a disability. No one will believe her often if she tries to say what has happened, so she's more exposed to violence. To talk a bit about marriage and family relations. There are institutions where, or if we talk about institutionalization, it is somehow when we limit the right to the person to live together in the community. But there are institutions that are focused specifically on women with disabilities. But in general, of 4 people who are living in these types of institutions, 3 of them are women with disabilities. Often if they have children, they're not sure how to be able to live together and stay together with their children. There's the issue of custody that they have to deal with, and once again, they have trouble with the custody because they don't have the possibility to live together in the community with all the rights that that entails. So here you can see on the screen the other recommendations that we've made concerning various countries. You can see it affects many countries, this issue. If there were more information about, or if we have more information about specific countries, that's thanks to the data that civil society organizations have gathered and other stakeholders. So lastly, in terms of living together in the community, what you can see here is the recommendations we've made to the states that we examined. Armenia, Portugal, these are fundamental recommendations that would need to be implemented to increase the situation of women living with disabilities. So I want to thank you once again for your attention, for inviting me here, and for taking into account this report and the issues that it talks about. I am at your disposal for answering any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Merci, thank you so much. Ms. Peláez, thank you for mentioning the specific occasions and disadvantages of the armed conflict across the member states of the Council of Europe. Indeed, we deal with many institutions on the ground, the reporting, the lack of information and support sometimes, but I can refer, if that deals with the case of Ukraine, we're trying to do our best right now to inform and also put the information points with other member states to prevent human trafficking, to do the registry. But we understand when 7 million people are fleeing, most of them who are women and children, who are sometimes offered free lift, which were not free lifts whatsoever, we had to deal with that on the spot, and together with the member states of the Council of Europe, we tackled that. I'm sure that Many members have seen their home countries with a very concrete reference, and I would like to ask probably our secretariat to share with the members this great presentation, because it refers to the firstly government sector. Maybe the national levels can also suggest the amendments and should suggest the amendments to the current laws, and of course. You mentioned the troubles in collecting the data, which takes us back again to recognizing different kinds of crimes and to justice, which always have to be provided to every human being based on the fact that we are human beings in the first place. Thank you for this amazing report and this great presentation. I would like us to hear also more from the president of GREVIO, Ms. Luarasi. She needs no further, she doesn't need no further introduction, except the fact that I would like to mention was the line of our discussion that Iris was the chairwoman of the Platform of Independent Expert Mechanism on the Elimination of Discrimination and Violence Against Women, which extends her profile and brings together this platform brings together UN and other international organization bodies at the expert level. And now, Iris, I pass the floor to you, please.
Thank you so much, dear members of the Equality Committee, dear members of PACE Parliamentary Network Women Free from Violence, Madam Chair, dear friends and colleagues. I would like to thank the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe for the invitation to speak here today at this joint hearing on preventing and combating violence against women with disabilities. And I would like also to thank Ms. Béatrice Fresko Rolfo for preparing such a useful and interesting report on preventing and combating violence against women with disabilities. This is a very important topic affecting the lives of many women across Europe, and which, of course, has not escaped the radar of GREVIO. I'm very happy to share the panel this morning with Ms. Ana Peláez Narváez, Chairperson of the CEDAW, and a great expert who has cooperated with the Council of Europe on a number of occasions on gender equality issues that are affecting women with disabilities. She has already set the scene for many of the points that I wanted to make today, and because of that, I will not talk more than 10 minutes to allow you to continue with the rest of the agenda and also for some questions. As president of the independent group of experts that monitors the implementation of the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, better known as the Istanbul Convention, I would like to put my remarks in the wider context of the Convention's approach, which is to prevent all forms of gender-based violence against women, to protect the victims and to prosecute the perpetrators, all through a comprehensive approach of integrated and coordinated policies and laws with a gender understanding of violence against women and in a non-discriminatory way. I will start with the Article 4 of the Convention, which is a key provision as it established the obligation for state parties to take measures to promote and protect the right of all women to live free from violence in both public and private sphere, condemn all forms of discrimination against women and take measures to prohibit such discrimination, and last but not least, implement the Convention, in particular, the measures to the rights of the victims without discrimination on any ground, such as disability or other status, among others included in an open-ended list. The obligation to ensure the effective application of the Convention in relation to all women and girls stems from the realization that discrimination of certain groups of women and girls who experience violence, for example, at the hands of law enforcement agencies, the judiciary, or service providers, is still widespread. Some of GREVIO's findings, as regards existing shortcomings at the national level to adequately protect and assist women with disabilities, victims of violence, includes lack of data, research, lack of studies about the prevalence of violence against women with disabilities. There is also lack of coordination between national policies on violence against women and policies on the rights of persons with disabilities. But we also have seen that there are some countries that are taking steps to link them. We have seen in our reports lack of accessible information on violence against women and available remedies to women with disabilities. But still, we have seen some countries that are providing accessible info. For example, it has been created a very nice website in Switzerland. In many countries, many shelters are not accessible to women with disabilities, and most of them do not accept victims of violence with psychosocial disabilities, and there is no alternative place to provide them with safety and address their needs. Many helplines for women that are victims of violence, they are also not accessible to women with hearing impairments. But on the positive note, I could say that the French helpline now is accessible. The prevalence of sexual violence, including rape, is higher among women with disabilities, especially women in institution, as it was mentioned from the report, and there is very little knowledge and limited remedies for these women. Forced abortion and sterilization still affect many women with psychosocial disabilities and without legal capacity. In many countries, the situation is not well known. There are also legal gaps when it comes to safeguarding the rights of these women to consent to such medical acts. But we have seen that laws are changing in some of the countries. For example, in Spain, they banned the sterilization of women under guardianships. There is also lack of support to report violence to the police and to participate in judicial proceedings, as there are persisting prejudices. As regards to the protection orders, when the women with disability are dependent on the perpetrator, the latter is also the support of the provider. So if a protection order is issued, the woman that is victim of violence is left without this support. Migrant and also asylum-seeking women with disabilities, they also face violence, and they also face obstacles to access protection and also relevant services. Many of them having psychosocial problems and PTSD problems and many more. So far, GREVIO has published 29 country baseline evaluation reports, and 7 more will be published by the end of this year, and all are accessible online. 2 years ago, in 2021, a horizontal midterm review for our evaluation work was prepared to also analyze GREVIO's conclusion and findings on a thematic basis. This report has been looking at the first 17 country evaluation reports that have been carried out from GREVIO, and one of the findings was that the majority of reports noted that reporting acts of violence and seeking assistance is particularly problematic for women with disabilities and mothers of children with disability. The obstacles encountered include the inaccessibility of police premises, stereotypes and lack of training of law enforcement officers, lack of information in accessible formats and support for the services available. And another relevant recommendation from GREVIO is the need to address the lack of involvement of organizations that are representing women who may experience intersecting forms of discrimination in the development of policies on violence against women. But we also have seen positive examples. So on this positive side, GREVIO has welcomed that in Malta, for example, it has been created a coordinating body for policies and measures to prevent and combat violence against women, and it has a diverse membership. It includes a person with disability, NGO representative, a victim, and a representative of the LGBTI community. Iceland has established rights protection officers for persons with disabilities to inform about their rights and ensure that they are respected. This involves, for example, that the police must call such an officer if a woman with disability reports being a victim of violence. In addition, An agreement between the Women's Shelter Association and hotels ensure accessibility for women with disabilities, as well as the same level of counseling and support. Germany developed a research study on the prevalence of violence against women with disabilities, and a more recent one that tackles the violence against women and women with disabilities living in institutions. Bosnia and Herzegovina has also conducted research on the experience of gender-based violence by the women with disabilities. Another crucial topic that I wanted to raise is the gaps in the protection of women with disabilities who lack capacity to consent, as regards two forms of violence against women that are covered by the Istanbul Convention: the need to criminalize forced abortion and forced sterilization, which is in line with the Article 39 of the Convention. I would give you a couple of concrete examples from GREVIO's monitoring work. In Serbia, GREVIO expressed concern with regards to the situation of women with disabilities in residential institutions who are particularly vulnerable to forced abortion. With respect to women with disabilities who are under guardianships, guardians frequently appear to give consent to an abortion on the assumption that this is in the best interest of the woman concerned. GREVIO clarified that more must be done to ensure that the medical intervention legally consented to by the guardian is in line with the actual will of the women concerned. In Spain, GREVIO noted that guardians could no longer authorize sterilization and that power is being given to the judges. But still, concerns remain about the lack of transparency for procedures for legal incapacitation, which may be initiated with a view to authorizing the sterilization of women with disabilities. GREVIO stressed that more had to be done to ensure that the reproductive rights of women with disabilities are respected by offering them the full range of birth control options without resorting to invasive and permanent measures such as sterilization. A draft law to repeal judicial authorization of sterilization and requiring the full and informed consent with women with disabilities was discussed also during GREVIO's evaluation, and it was adopted in October 2020. To finish my intervention, I would like to briefly refer to the new questionnaire for its first thematic evaluation report, which GREVIO has launched in 2023. The questionnaire is publicly available in GREVIO's website, and it is entitled Building Trust by Delivering Support, Protection, and Justice. I strongly believe that the trust of women victims of violence, including women with disabilities, is essential to move ahead in preventing and combating gender-based violence and violence against women, but by also prosecuting perpetrators. I hope that you found my intervention useful for your ongoing work on this topic, and I'm, of course, very happy to answer your question about GREVIO's work and at your disposal for further discussing during this hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Iris. Thank you very much. Colleagues, including some time limitations, I would like to invite you to jump in to the question and answers session. And I already see Margaret, who would want to ask the first question. Please, Margaret.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for your presentations, all three of you, also Béatrice. My question is, well, first, I have a concern, because I think when we talk about women with disabilities, it's such a wide range of women and such a wide range of topics which are not comparable at all, I would say. It's totally different if you have a physical disability or a mental health problem, or you're disabled in a way that well, it's very difficult to make up your mind, or you're not able to communicate at all. So it's a very wide range, and by putting it all together in one word, women with disabilities, well, I'm not sure if that's right to it all. And my question is about the most severe group, I would say the women often live in institutions who are not able to communicate or who are functioning on the level of a 5-year-old child. I'm working as a victims lawyer as well, and I've had some cases in my practice, and what I always find very difficult when it comes to consent, it's so difficult to look at it, both the consent for the sexual act, because we do not want to put we should not put our vision of should this person have sex as the measurements. So also women with disabilities should be able to have sex to their choice. But it's very hard to imagine if it's consensual sex or if it's violence, but also consent to what measures to be taken, to giving testimonies. So, well, I don't have a solution, and I'm sure you won't have one fixed one, but maybe some ideas on how to deal with this very difficult group. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, dear Margaret. Indeed, when we look at the recommendations which were outlined by Iris, and you have colleagues, you also should have this intervention printed. The dimension and the scope of the issues we are touching upon is immense, but that's why we are one of the bravest committees with the most efficient number of resolutions and problems tackled. But indeed, I'm as well. In my constituency, we have a school for children with eyesight disabilities, and we continue working with those who finished the schools, who are already working or are searching for jobs, including women and children who are girls, surely. And there is an extreme different range of issues and problems. Before passing the floor to Béatrice, I would like to pass the floor to Petra for the question.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria, and I would like to thank both speakers for their insightful introductions. I have an observation, more even for Béatrice. As members of Parliament, we make legislation that should protect women from these types of violence. But I'm aware, I became aware of how limited our own knowledge is about accessibility to our own colleagues when one of my colleagues in the second chamber in the Netherlands, who has a hearing deficiency, made clear to all of us how difficult it is to work with a disability in our own parliamentarian environment. So, Béatrice, I would like you to look into how we can have recommendation of awareness in our own institutions, because once you, and it's also the language, because using the word blind spot is ableism. Now I'm using the dead angle. You know, we need a mirror sometimes to see the corner. But then again, it's seeing and hearing. And I think I would like to call on all of our colleagues, look around in your buildings. How accessible is our democracy? And if our own democracy isn't accessible, how can we make our legislation accessible for people of all genders with disabilities? Thank you.
Thank you, Petra. Sorry, Béatrice, one more intervention from Madam Jones, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank everybody for your contributions. And obviously the Rapporteur, it's a massive subject. Really, to get all this down in one report is tricky. But I just want to say that in terms of where we go, I used to work as a physiotherapist, many people know, with children and young people with learning difficulties and disabilities. And it's really important that we take account of what they want and where they go in all of this. It's not for us to sort of paternalise this. It's important that we get very, very clearly from the young people exactly what they want, the young women what they want. And also I want, given our financial constraints at the moment with the cost of living crisis in lots of areas of the world at the moment, supportive living out in the community costs more. The resources are intense, they need a lot more. support, which is quite right, and that's where we want people to be. But it's important that we remember that at the moment the cost constraints, the natural aim is to try and keep people in institutions. And as you quite rightly say, if there are criminal acts going on, we must make sure that we get in there and we understand exactly what's going on in these institutions. So important, and I think you're quite right to highlight that. And in terms of the capacity and deprivation of liberty, you've already, very clearly highlighted the points there. But I would say, if there are best practices going on out there, for instance, in villages, in an area near where I live, we have a village for people with learning difficulties or disabilities, and it's a brilliant place. It's a very good atmosphere, very safe. And those are the sorts of places I would ask that you go to and visit, so as we can say, yes, this is best practice, this is what we aspire to. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Madam Jones. Béatrice, would you want to pose a question or have some final remark?
Ce sera peut-être plutôt des questions.
Maybe just some questions, Madam Chair. I agree absolutely about the fact that this issue of a person with disabilities is a wide field. Someone who is, for example, a visual handicap, someone who has a physical handicap, etc., are not the same. However, I would like to ask some questions about institutions. Someone suggested that perhaps we could make visits to institutions. But, for example, a social worker who would make specific visits to people or medical visits outside to be able to make sure that those persons could speak freely, these women with disabilities could speak freely. Not a visit with a gynecologist inside the institution, but outside, maybe once per year or more, just to make sure that there's a proper monitoring or follow-up. I'm quite concerned about the loss of legal capacity that these people with handicaps have, those who work together with a guardian, or even if we're talking about a judge, because in some countries the system is such that one might choose, for example, directly sterilization rather than talking together with this woman about how to issue problems. So I'm wondering if you have suggestions specifically about how there could be how we could limit this loss of freedom, or to perhaps focus it in a different direction that's more humane in nature.
Colleagues, I would want to suggest 5 minutes for each guest to reply to the questions if they wish so.
Merci beaucoup pour les...
Thank you very much for those questions and observations. About the issue of legal capacity, we've got the example of Ireland, one of the first countries in Europe that changed its legislation to assure greater ability for people with disabilities to take their own decisions, supporting them to take decisions where a decision needs to be taken related specifically to the disability, be it intellectual or a psychosocial handicap, a disability. I think this is one good example to take into account. Other countries have also followed the example of Ireland. And we've seen that that's the direction to be moving towards. In terms of this surveillance of institutions that you've mentioned, I'm not sure that the cost to living in a community could actually be more expensive than it is to live within an institution. But human rights issues have got nothing to do. They're not comparable. And they're not necessarily something to take into account when talking about human rights. One has a right to live within the community, to be included within the community. No matter how much that costs, it must be done. It's a right. A right to live in community with others. In my country, for example, we've seen there's been economic studies carried out that it can be cheaper, actually, to aid people to live in the community than to live within institutions. So once again, what is fundamental, though, is that's an issue of human rights. So this type of surveillance with public authorities to try to see what's actually going on within institutions is actually something that's basic, fundamental. It must be done. For that reason, the idea of making visits to institutions and other places, well, the surveillance or monitoring of institutions is indeed an issue that needs to be done and needs to be worked on further. So once again, I thank you all for your comments. About diversity of disability, yes, of course, we've talked about someone maybe who that we need to be able to take into account to see this diversity of disability. The people who have been most vulnerable to problems with human rights are those who can't speak. If we talk about people of intellectual or psychosocial disabilities, that's where that's absolutely fundamental to take into account. But there are other disabilities which deserve to be focused on, because those people might not be able to speak always about the actual violations of their human rights that have happened. They can't come here and talk about that. So we have to take into, for example, people who are deaf and blind, or people who have cerebral paralysis. Those are two examples, but there's many others. That diversity of disability must be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Peláez. Iris, would you want to comment, please?
Very briefly, I just wanted to say that the Convention is about all forms of violence. So that's why we try to be very wide in the angle that we see also the question of women with disabilities. But at the same time, the scope of the Convention, it's also covering other forms of violence against women. So that's why in our work in GREVIO, we see that as a complementary work, also based on the work of this committee. We also do a lot of desk research when we do the monitoring visit. And we also read a lot of reports that have been in different questions. So in every country that we visit, we have a special angle when it comes for women and girls with disabilities. We rely a lot on the CEDAW reports in specific questions, and disability is among them. So our first experience with the baseline evaluation procedure absolutely has shown that it is a long way to have the victims' trust in the system, and it is supposed that to protect them and give justice and also redress the violence that they suffer. But we are trying to do that, especially in our second round of the evaluation. So for that, we are planning to specifically address how the authorities ensure that policies on violence against women and domestic violence, they put the rights and empowerment of women that are victims of violence at specific institutions, what measures are being taken to enhance the intersectionality of all relevant national policies that have to be in line with the Article 4 of the Convention, the measures that are being taken to reduce legal or practical barriers that prevent women that are victims of violence, including women with disabilities, from accessing regular health care, the measures that are taken to instill confidence in law enforcement officials, including those that are aimed at addressing any language or procedural difficulties encountering when lodging complaints. We also foresee to see the measures to facilitate the identification and care of women victims of violence in institutions for persons with disabilities, And last but not least, we also plan to ensure how the authorities are ensuring that different groups of women and girls, including women with disabilities, are fully informed, understand, and freely give their consent to procedures such as sterilization and also abortion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I think we can go on and on and on. The contributions of the report to the Béatrice endeavors, and I'm sure the text will be impressive. We can still coordinate meanwhile during the preparation phase of the report. And as we have already confirmed the fact-finding visit, colleagues, I think that we will consider further knowledge and experience in our mutual work. And Béatrice, we wish you luck and inspiration in this important and quite challenging file. And we would like again to thank our dear colleagues with their high expertise. I think each and every one of us have learned and have been tasked in a manner of being a parliamentarian. What can we take back home as further tasks for improvements? We thank you very much, and we look forward to our future endeavors. Thank you. Thank you, colleagues.